Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into Robert Greene's ideas, specifically looking at his core insights on power dynamics and mental resilience. The real question for us is how these principles, which can sometimes feel a bit sharp-edged, actually play out in the modern corporate world, the highly competitive office environment we all recognize.
Exactly. And the source material gives us this really quite profound diagnosis of, well, our modern condition. Greene basically argues we're suffering from a deep mental imbalance. Why? Because the structure we live and work in, this competitive system, has us, quote, working too hard and constantly thinking too much. It's exhausting.
Right, it is. And that brings up the central tension, doesn't it? Do you adopt the mindset of the game of power, using psychological mastery and a kind of strategic detachment to, well, survive, and maybe find some mental freedom in all the corporate toxicity? Or does that very approach just end up feeding the cycle? Does it reinforce the cultural insecurity that Greene himself says is driving this mental fatigue? My position is that, look, mastering this psychological game is pretty much essential. It's self-protection, and it's how you carve out space to do actual meaningful work.
Mm-hmm. And I see it differently. I'm going to argue that this kind of ruthless, strategic approach, especially let's be honest, the cynicism it often requires, actually perpetuates the very competitive environment that leaves us feeling insecure and, frankly, burned out.
Okay, I definitely acknowledge the ethical tightrope there. But let me try and frame the necessity maybe a bit differently. Greene is quite clear. The world we operate in, the quote, game, is completely dynamic. It is never stable. Your position, your power, it's always in flux, either increasing or decreasing. So in today's insecure corporate landscape, getting good at the game isn't really optional. It's defensive. And the absolute key principle here is that power is a game of pure psychology. Purely. It's not about the stats, not the data points on a report. We see this constantly, right? High-level hiring decisions, CEOs, VPs. Often it comes down to subjective perception. Do they look powerful? Do they project calm, confidence, authority? It's not always about the objective numbers. Now, mastering this, that grants independence and freedom and room to maneuver. And crucially, it frees up your mind to be creative and do things that are actually important. You can step away from getting tangled up in the emotional bullshit, the politicking. So I see this mastery as the path to achieving some kind of inner balance by focusing on actually creating things, not just reacting and talking endlessly.
I absolutely agree. We have to understand the dynamics of the game, no question. But my focus shifts to the cultural cost of playing it that way. Greene himself points out that a lot of this modern mental imbalance, it's a cultural phenomenon. It's rooted in this hyper-competitive, fundamentally insecure environment where people have to, quote, struggle so hard just to make a living, just to get by. Let's face it, the modern workplace often doesn't satisfy us in any deep way. So when you adopt that strategic posture Greene describes, you inevitably find yourself having to abide by rules of the game that inwardly you do not believe in. That creates a kind of necessary duality, right? A split. And that requires constant self-monitoring, turning you further inward. It feeds the very problem Greene identifies being too self-involved, thinking too much about strategy, about image, about how you're coming across, rather than, the actual work.
That's a fair description of the defensive posture. Yeah. But where I think we really diverge is on its usefulness, its utility. Since power is, as Greene argues and as we see, pure psychology, well, ignoring that reality basically guarantees failure. It doesn't matter how good your output is if the perception is wrong. We have to talk about what success actually looks like in today's office. Why do we see so many people rise who, if we're being objective, seem maybe less competent than others? It's because, as Greene notes, power isn't like baseball, which he says is maybe 95% statistics and data. Corporate life, perception often trumps reality. You have to control the narrative, manage how you're seen, to get ahead, and ultimately to gain the freedom to actually create. Refusing to engage with the psychological reality? That's just, it's like refusing to acknowledge the terrain you're walking on.
See, I come at it from a different angle. I'd argue that prioritizing this subjective perception over objective data isn't the solution. It's actually a symptom of the cultural imbalance we're talking about. If everyone is constantly focused on managing their image, maintaining that perfect facade of calm, carefully crafting the tone of every single email, always needing to appear busy and completely in control. They just reinforce the insecure environment that forces everyone to struggle so hard. It becomes a vicious cycle. If the real goal is self-mastery, inner freedom, why pour all your mental energy into mastering a system that actively elevates illusion, sometimes, over genuine competence? It feels like we're just trading one kind of stress, the stress of potential burnout, for another. The strategic fatigue of constant performance management, always being on.
Okay, strategic fatigue is a risk, I grant you that. But the alternative is often becoming a political casualty. If you choose not to manage perception, believe me, others will manage it for you, and probably not in a way that benefits you. But look, if you achieve a certain level of influence, of power, through that strategic detachment, you then earn the breathing room, the right to focus more purely on competence, on the substance. The psychological mastery isn't the end goal. It's the key. It unlocks the door to the room where the real creative work, the meaningful stuff can actually happen.
But that requires constant vigilance, doesn't it? Let's dig into that self-monitoring a bit more. I'm really not convinced that this strategic detachment isn't at its core inherently cynical. Think about the instruction Greene gives. To abide by rules, even rules that touch on sensitive, politically correct, or socially charged areas, rules that you do not inwardly believe in. At what point does that strategic necessity just become toxic self-suppression? This kind of forced duality, pretending to agree or conform, it's emotionally draining. Isn't that just another flavor of thinking too much? Obsessing over strategy, image, saying the right thing, instead of reaching for the kind of authenticity that might actually lead to inner stillness?
I think characterizing it as inherent cynicism might be missing the point slightly. Greene, I think, is just describing social reality as it is, quite bluntly. These pro-social and good rules, things like, not harassing colleagues, maintaining a professional tone in meetings, basically not being a disruptive force, these are non-negotiable if you don't want to find yourself in a world of trouble. Strategic detachment here isn't about believing every single word of every corporate memo or social trend. It's about recognizing the necessary constraints of the social environment and using emotional discipline to preserve your own energy. It stops you from getting sucked into the emotional bullshit, from taking every minor slight or disagreement personally. It's about building an internal fortress, really, so the pettiness or the politics swirling around you don't dictate your own mental state.
But the line between that kind of discipline and just draining hypocrisy feels incredibly thin sometimes. If I'm constantly masking my genuine internal reaction, maybe frustration, maybe disagreement, just to maintain this carefully calibrated professional persona, well, I'm investing significant mental energy into upholding an illusion. And we're already suffering, as Greene points out, from overstimulation, right? We're perpetually outward-focused, checking who said what on Slack, trying to anticipate the next reorg, the next shift in corporate priorities. The remedy he suggests involves finding the simple things in life, finding community. But how can you build genuine community or authentic connection if your primary mode of interaction involves strategic adherence to external rules, especially rules you don't truly believe in? It seems to reinforce the inward focus on self-management, cutting you off from the very things that might heal the imbalance.
But that's precisely why the initial mastery is so critical. It's what gives you the ability, the perspective to actually step back. The ultimate win here, as the source material states, is about learning and adapting. It's about achieving mental independence. And the cure for this modern self-involvement, as Greene suggests, is activity, to actually go out and create, to make things. Winning the power game strategically, it grants you the space, the freedom needed to redirect your energy away from the endless politicking and toward focused creation. That's when work can start to feel, as he puts it, like therapy. That detachment becomes the mental resilience. It allows you to shift your focus from personal status anxiety, from reacting to actively building.
Okay, I understand the promise of that freedom. The appeal of getting space to be creative, I really do. But the context of this dynamic game seems to constantly work against it. If power is, as Greene says, perpetually increasing or decreasing, well, then the individual has to remain perpetually vigilant, don't they? You have to worry about, quote, younger people emerging who are hungrier, maybe more creative. That inherent competition means the very moment you feel you've carved out some creative freedom, you immediately have to start defending that space. This constant state of defense, of psychological engagement, it feels inherently self-involved. It seems to contradict the stated goal of finding activity that will get you out of yourself. The sheer competitive intensity of the game undermines the possibility of sustained focus on community, on helping other people, which the material itself suggests is vital for true cultural balance.
Look, that struggle, that vigilance, maybe that's just the cost of doing business in the kind of hierarchical competitive structures we have today. These psychological tools Greene describes, they aren't meant to create some kind of perfect utopian existence free of conflict. They're designed for survival, for navigating an inherently unstable environment. If the game demands vigilance, well, mastery of the game allows you to be vigilant strategically using minimal energy rather than emotionally, which is what really leads to burnout. The ability to observe the system calmly, detach from your own ego getting bruised, that's the true mental resilience. It allows you to focus on the active building. Yes, even while keeping one eye on the political terrain. It's about navigating, not escaping entirely.
But if the ultimate goal is genuinely self-mastery, why prioritize mastering a system that is, by its own description here, flawed? A system that arguably forces you to live at least partly unauthentically. We seem to agree on the diagnosis. The culture can make us sick. My concern is that adopting this particular strategy, while perhaps effective for climbing the ladder, ultimately prevents us from achieving that deeper, quieter mental balance that comes from genuine engagement, from getting outside of ourselves.
Okay, so let's summarize. We definitely agree on the diagnosis. The corporate world is tough, it's competitive, insecure, and heavily defined by psychological maneuvering. My position fundamentally rests on the immediate need for self-preservation within that reality. Understanding power's dynamic and perceptual nature isn't just interesting theory. It's crucial, it's practical for navigating professional life today. Mastering this game strategically offers perhaps the only realistic path I see toward gaining mental freedom and creating the space for sustained, valuable output by minimizing how much you get dragged into the corporate bullshit. It's about achieving a kind of personal sovereignty in a world that seems designed to consume your mental energy.
And I'd summarize by saying, yes, I concede the profound truth in Greene's diagnosis of our cultural imbalance, the overstimulation, the anxiety. It resonates. However, I still maintain that the kind of strategic self-management, the constant vigilance required to win, according to these rules, inevitably reinforces the very self-involvement and strategic fatigue that contribute to the mental imbalance in the first place. So by adopting this remedy, which might be necessary for short-term survival, we risk perpetuating the underlying illness and hindering the deeper, perhaps cultural shift needed for lasting mental well-being.
It certainly forces us to confront a really difficult tension, doesn't it? That immediate, practical need for self-preservation in the world as it is, versus the ideal of a more balanced, maybe more authentic way of living and working.
Is it truly about mastering yourself, developing an inner resilience so that the pressures and politics of the competitive world don't end up mastering you?